Great to hear everybody, or to be heard on the famous Bible Geek show. I believe I'm on without the customary difficulties today, but if I'm not, I hope you'll let me know as you sit there looking at your watch, tapping nervously on the desktop. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Well, I've got, as always, a bunch of good questions, but I thought before I got into them I would just have a little station ID, because here I am on that brand spanking new network, freethoughtmedia.com. I expect great things from this in the future, and I know you do, and I think we're getting off to a great start here with a fair and balanced approach to biblical criticism and those who doubt it. I'd like to just mention a couple of oddball things to get you thinking about and maybe get a couple of comments on. I should have mentioned this last week, but I wonder if anybody saw this thing on trading spouses. Not Wife Swap that Reg Fenley was on, but the one from the other network. I got them mixed up. I think this is the ABC one, not the Fox one, but at any rate, the one couple is the same premise pretty much. The one family was a bunch of sort of progressive New Age types with their own implausible beliefs, but they appear to be very balanced and with it. The other family was some kind, I think, of Pentecostals, and the woman who you can't miss her. She appeared to be about 800 pounds. She looked like a Humvee shouting "Praise the Lord." She was the one to go over to this New Age couple's family instead, and holy mackerel-andy, what a volcanic explosion. This was just really quite a display, and I guess the thing that hit me, besides the fact that, there's fanaticism for you, was this poor lady really seemed to be unhinged. It was like, it wasn't so much that she was an example, good or bad, of fundamentalism or Pentecostalism, as that she was just gone. And this religion happened to be a good shtick for her to choose to express that. I think there is a difference between somebody being a nut and latching on to religion as their idiom of nuttiness on the one hand, and on the other, people who would ordinarily be quite balanced, but their religion acts as some kind of strange drug that drives them mad, as in the case of certain jihadist religions out there. But just something to think about. Is the religious nut I'm looking at really just a nut, or are they nutty because they're religious? I don't think it's really a chicken and egg sort of a thing. I think you can kind of tell after a while. This woman seemed to me just to be a nut, but maybe they'll have a sequel. They did rerun it recently, and I tell you what an astounding performance. Well, with that, let's get on to some questions. And again, I think I got the Skype thing going, so you could call in if you're lucky enough to be a part of that. But I can also get questions on the chat room, of course, and as usual from my Bible Geek question page. And there's some good ones there. I think I'll start up with from Dan Ross in Maine. He says, I was reading an article online discussing the empty tomb, and it mentioned that Arimathea translates as the town of the best apostle, or something close to that, I guess. Fitting, since Joseph was the one apostle who did not abandon Jesus. We've seen that in the Old Testament, people's names are often symbolic, which infers the legendary character, actually implies the legendary nature of the stories, with Jesus Christ being the anointed Savior, and Peter being the rock. Are there any other New Testament names that are symbolic as well? And what is the difference between this and the Dead Sea Scrolls, where there are no names, only descriptive titles? Yep. Could it be that if those texts were more popular, then those titles would have come to be used as names as well? Though the evil priest would probably not be the most popular baby name, I guess. Well, Dan. Yeah, I think you're right. The person that came up with this decoding of Arimathea is of course the brilliant Richard Carrier, and he suggested that's what it means. It's not like there wasn't a place whose name could have been rendered Arimathea. If you look it up in Bible dictionaries, there are places that sound pretty much like that in one ancient source or another. But why bring it up? It's not like the narrative is otherwise crowded with Josephs so that you have to set them off by epithets, as you do with Simon. So you got Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon Magus, Simon the Leper, Simon the Pharisee, or even Jesus, Jesus Justus, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Barabbas. So why Joseph of Arimathea? I think he's very likely right that it is a kind of a wink, and that the name is really indicating an ideal, that is, fictive, symbolic figure, one of Tsvetan Todorov's narrative men, a character in a story who is barely a character at all, who just exists to get something done in a particular narrative, and he is even named sometimes for his narrative function, as in one Victorian novel Todorov cites, where there's an incompetent doctor who's called Dr. Philgrave. So Joseph of Arimathea, who I suspect is he's called Joseph because he's like a father figure, and reflecting the idea of Joseph as the father of Jesus. And he's like a father figure because he's also based on Priam, the father of Hector, who goes to Agamemnon and or Achilles begging the body of the slain Hector. As Dennis MacDonald suggests, I think that's probably right. And so this is double code Joseph, the father figure, also Arimathea, from the place of best apostles. So Carrier is, as almost always, no doubt right about that. And there are indeed other narrative men in the New Testament, and you have to wonder if this is not a signal to the reader that these are not historical figures, just like in the Pilgrim's Progress, where you got Pilgrim and Christian and people like that. What are some of them? Well, one is Martha, Mary and Martha of Bethany. What do we know about them? Well, one thing, they offer hospitality to Jesus, at least in the Luke 10 passage. And really, again, the same thing in John 11 after Lazarus is raised. But Martha happens to mean lady of the house. Well, that's, it kind of fits all that she does. So it implies the story is made up for the sake of the point, which I deal with at nauseating and tedious length in my book, The Widow Traditions in Luke Acts, where I deconstruct that one in great detail. Another one is Zacchaeus, who does one thing, right? He's the tax collector who who wants to see Jesus, and the press of the crowd around Jesus makes it impossible, with the result that he has to go up into the crook of a tree to see Jesus passing. It says before he was short. Interestingly, does that mean Zacchaeus is short and couldn't see over the crowd? Or that Jesus was a short man and therefore Zacchaeus couldn't see him over the crowd? Well, who knows? But nonetheless, Jesus says, "Hey, Zach, come on down. I'm having lunch at your house today." And everybody says, "Oh, what's this? He's going to be the guest of a notorious, no-good tax collector." And Jesus says, now wait a minute. And Zacchaeus says to him, "Hey, look, I give half of what I make to the poor, and if I find I've defrauded somebody, I give them 4 times as much as I took in restitution." And that's all we know about the guy. And Jesus says, "Well, you see, there's a true son of Abraham." And, well, Zacchaeus seems to come from the root Zaki, which means almsgiving, which is what it means in Islam also, one of the 5 pillars of the faith, to give zakat, the alms to the poor. So apparently this story is told again just to illustrate what a tax gatherer would have to do to be pious and repentant, much as in the earlier Lucan passage where Luke sets out the requirements for righteous soldiers and others by having John the Baptist tell them what their repentance would entail, no extortion and this and that and the other thing. Nicodemus in the Gospel of John would appear to be another one. What does it say about him? He is a ruler of the Jews, namely a member of the Sanhedrin. What does the name Nicodemus mean? Ruler of the people. Well, it's not that there weren't people named Nicodemus. It was a real name, but you have to wonder, right? I mean, these things aren't definite, but after a while you see a pattern. Another one is Stephen, the first martyr, the proto-martyr as they call him, which sort of makes me think of him as some kind of a changeling from Deep Space Nine or something. But at any rate, the first martyr, what do you know, Stephen in Greek means crown, and the guy wins the crown of martyrdom. In this case, I think Hans-Joachim Scheps and Robert Eisenman are correct that this is really a retelling of the story of the martyrdom of James the Just, but it's being reshuffled as Luke does many things in Acts, and that he's making the characters play musical chairs in the same way he makes Peter, the apostle, to the Gentiles, and has Paul go to the synagogues, just the opposite of what we would guess from the Pauline epistles. Well, he attributes to this, I think, fictive character, Stephen, the martyrdom, the winning of the crown of James the Just. So there are at least those New Testament fictive names, I think, and I'm sure there are other ones as well. What you say about the names and titles, I don't know enough about the Hebrew of the character ciphers in the Dead Sea Scrolls to know if they're even viable names, but a lot of them sure are. Well, like the Teacher of Righteousness could be, because in fact I think that's actually been taken as a name. That might be some variation of Zechariah, but it's you're right, like the spouter of lies and the evil priest. You ever notice how nobody has names that mean bad stuff? You look up any name book and the name is always something good. Linda means beautiful. Robert, my own name, means what the heck was it now? Of shining fame. And so on. Well, there's nobody with a name in any language where it means deadbeat or nuisance or something like that, right? So you probably don't have too many of those, but it would be kind of funny. I always try to be helpful when people are looking for names for kids they're pregnant with. Let's give her a good Bible name. Oh, well, how about Jezebel? Let's give him a good name from the Bible. Hey, I haven't heard Pontius Pilate recently. Or if you want to go further afield, how about Arphaxad? I kind of like the ring of that, right? Hey, everybody, it's Arphaxad Smith, but they haven't caught up with me yet. Tim V from Denville, New Jersey, apparently identical with Citizen V in Marvel Comics, who turned out to be Baron Zemo. Anyway, are you familiar with the claim made by groups like Family Radio, among others, that WFME in Orange, New Jersey, I used to be on a show or two of theirs millennia ago, the claim that the church age has ended. The idea is that true believers have been called to leave their, quote, corporate churches behind and presumably meet in small groups at each other's house. Does the Bible appear to actually support this idea in any way? Well, the only way I can think of is that, of course, the New Testament was written before there were churches one could go to. They probably held church in the largest house of any wealthy member they had. They would gather there, or wherever they could, and there weren't any basilicas or anything yet. But that doesn't. And if you're one of these people who is hag-ridden, that you have to do everything exactly as the earliest Christians did, I guess you could do that. It would be kind of like the Plymouth Brethren, who at least ostensibly refused to have clergy, because there were none of those for obvious reasons in the earliest church, it being a lay sectarian movement, though I believe many of the brethren do now have full-time workers. Not pastors, mind you. But I have never heard this associated with a theology of church or other dispensations. This sounds to me like some version of what some call hyper-dispensationalism. You're probably familiar with the dispensational theology of John Nelson Darby, Church of Ireland priest or bishop, I forget which, who recuperating from an accident where he had been thrown from a horse, studied the Bible quite a bit and decided that he should get out of the Church of Ireland and start up a whole new movement based on primitive, pristine New Testament church order, no pastors, etc. This was the Plymouth Brethren, and also based on a distinctive theology called dispensationalism, and the notion was that God has organized salvation history in a series of dispensations or economies or administrations or whatever you want to call it, different arrangements. The rules changed at different times. And in each one he gave human beings a chance to prove themselves worthy, or at least to relate to him in one way or another. And most of the dispensations ended with failure, and God began again. The first dispensation was that of innocence in the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve got along well with God, and they had not yet been tempted, so they weren't righteous, but they weren't unrighteous, they were merely innocent. Well, this dispensation must have lasted for all of 15 seconds before they fell into sin, and then we had the dispensation of conscience, which took up from Adam and Eve getting their fig leaf loincloths and so on, all the way up until the time of the flood of Noah, which of course was a big failure for the conscience dispensation. And when Noah offered a sacrifice at the end of the flood, and God gave him a set of basic laws, no bloodshed, etc. These now you can eat meat and so on and so forth. This was called the dispensation of human government. This lasted until, not that there wasn't going to be any government after that, but this was the thing that inaugurated it, so they called it that, or Darby did, for want of a better term. He didn't claim he got them right out of the Bible. But this one lasted until Abraham brought in the dispensation of promise, where it was all based on pleasing God was a matter of believing in his promises, whatever he should promise, like notably Isaac being born, but also the future inheritance of the Holy Land. And this one lasted until Moses came along and brought in the dispensation of law. This one lasted until the death and resurrection of Jesus, which brought in the dispensation of grace, also known as the church age. Well, these things weren't known in advance. They weren't prophesied, not all of them anyway. Darby and Cyrus I. Scofield after him said that the dispensation of grace, or the church age, was the great parenthesis. Nobody had known to expect it. The prophets hadn't talked about it. They had only talked about future developments with Israel and Judah. But that here was this unexpected thing God did, creating a dispensation of salvation for Jews and Gentiles independent of the law, but based on the faith in Jesus Christ. Actually, that was revealing how anybody's faithfulness had ever saved them. It was always because of the death of Christ that would come or had come, but it became known at this time. Well, this will end at the rapture, when the church, all the true Christians, are taken up into the heavens and awaiting the Great Tribulation. And I guess the tribulation of 7 years is itself how many are we up to? I think the 6th dispensation. It is ended at the second coming of Christ at Armageddon, and the millennium is the 7th dispensation, after which history as we know it is over and there's a new creation. Well, those were the 7 dispensations, but others like Otis Sellers came along later, I think Otis Q. Sellers to be exact, and argued that there were various dispensations even within the book of Acts, and so forth, and different Pauline letters were the official scripture of particular short dispensations. And one ultra-dispensationalist group said that the only thing canonical for now, I think, if I remember this right, was the prison epistles of Paul and the Gospel of John. Well, this may be a similar hyper-dispensational kind of a thing, suggesting that the church age is divided up into different schemata, and that true believers must leave groups even like the Orthodox Presbyterians or the Conservative Baptists. Most dispensationalists don't have trouble with evangelical fundamentalist groups, but there have always been people like, what's his name, who started the Baptists, Roger Williams, who was an ultra-sectarian and finally decided that he had taken it about as far as he could when he would only have communion with his wife, and then said, what are we doing? And dropped the Plymouth Brethren-like policy of closed communion. Well, there have always been groups that figured that they had to be absolutely holy and just met in tiny cells. So maybe these people think that is now the order of the day. I don't know. I'm a little surprised Family Radio would get into that, because their guiding light is Harold Camping, who was kind of a hyper-Calvinist. I wouldn't think he would have gone in for this, but I guess I just don't know enough about that. Fascinating stuff. Boy, I tell you, fundamentalism is just exceedingly interesting. I wouldn't want to be in that club anymore, but just fascinating stuff. Let's see what I've got in the chat room. I got plenty of other questions here, but I hope they're in red yes, indeed, we do have some. And, how about this? By whom, where, and when were the J and E versions of the Old Testament written? By whom, where, and when were J and E combined with D and P to produce the final version of the Old Testament? What was the stimulus that led to the compilation of these separate texts to form the Old Testament? Well, this is a great question. I love this topic. It's been all kind of thrown up into the air again because of a lot of arguments that redate the sources. But let me give you the old-time religion, hallelujah, of Graff and Wellhausen, who hatched the documentary hypothesis. Again, there's some attempt to date the documents later, that is younger, but this is the way I learned it, and I don't yet know the reasons for other views. Actually, we're talking about the 4 sources behind the Pentateuch, not the whole Old Testament. And some of these sources may actually continue beyond the Pentateuch. There have been theories that you've got J and E or P material on into the Deuteronomic history, that you find some of it in Joshua, Judges, and Samuel even. I have to admit, I don't know enough about those debates, but at least the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are based on 4 original sources. The oldest of these is called J because, a couple of reasons. It refers to God constantly as Yahweh or Jehovah, and in German well, you spell Yahweh, W. I'm sorry, what's with me today? It must be too early still. Yahweh, a transliteration from Hebrew. And so people say Yahweh. I think that is wrong. Germans did the transliterating, and they pronounced that Yahweh. That's what they're trying to get across. So you'd say it like a Y, but spell it like a J, or at least they did when they were putting this together. They spelled it with a J. If we want to get the same sound, we have to take their J and make it into a Y. They spelled it Jahveh. So I'm sorry, that rightly come across into English as Yahweh, and but same thing as they're trying to represent as Jehovah, so that's a J. All throughout, people are calling God Yahweh or Jehovah. Also, most of the stories take place in the south of the Holy Land, namely Judah, or Yehuda, but let's stick with the conventional English. So there's two J's, Jehovah and Judah. The location is because these stories were collected as oral traditions in the South by someone who lived there. We don't know who it was, or we probably used their name, but the best guess is it was someone who worked for the royal court in the time of either King Solomon or his son Rehoboam, when there was a lot of cultural interest and a lot of money to do something about it, and they were trying to gather a lot of the old stories that were told at the various sanctuaries and shrines and sacred wells and groves and graves and so forth. And that's what a lot of them are. Some of the stories are no more than just saying Abraham stopped at Shechem and saw a God who said, "Don't worry, I'll be with you," and he built an altar there and moved on, because if you went to Shechem, that's what the priest would tell you. This is why you ought to come here. This is why it's a holy place. So Jay collected all these stories from the South, much like what the Brothers Grimm did. They knew there were all these great stories, and they didn't want them to perish, so they compiled a whole lot of them. Now, it now turns out from archaeology that there was no great, fabulous, affluent kingdom of David or Solomon. There was no great Abbasid court of David and Solomon, so the wealth and leisure that are presupposed by the theory that Jay was some sort of an antiquarian part of their court, that's eroded. So I don't know if we can depend on that date or that theory of who it was, but you can still say that yes, it appears to be a compilation of stories from Judah in which God is called Jehovah or Yahweh. And it does seem still to be the first one, even though we don't have an absolute date, because when you compare it with later sources in the Pentateuch, you have a more primitive depiction of God. In the J source, God simply appears as a character on stage. He just shows up at Abraham's campfire. He just knocks on the door and tells Noah what to do to build the ark, and then closes the door behind him, and so on. In later texts, he doesn't appear that way. He speaks from heaven instead, or in dreams. Also, Jay does not mind entertaining the reader with the faults and foibles of his characters. He doesn't mind showing Abraham as a henpecked husband and Jacob as a schemer and so forth. The stories were supposed to be funny as well as edifying. That changes later when people begin to think, oh no, everyone ought to be a saint. Let's describe them in that kind of bowdlerized way. So that's J, the first one. The E version. Oh yeah, let me just tell you one other thing about J. J starts with the creation, the Garden of Eden story. It does not have the 7 days of creation. It begins with God creating the Garden of Eden, and then the man, and then the animals, and then the woman, and so forth. And then it goes on from there. And it goes on through the time of Moses, perhaps even later than that. Okay, E is the second great epic that was compiled in the north, in the land of Ephraim, or Ephraim, however you prefer to say it, E-P-H-R-A-I-M. Raim. That was a name used for northern Israel. And again, the stories generally take place there, and so they were probably researched and compiled there by a similar bard or antiquarian or something. Here, God is called Elohim, not Yahweh, at least until you get to the time of Moses, where you find a story in the beginning of Exodus where God says, okay, from now on, I'm to be known as Yahweh, not just Elohim. And then after that, the sources are a little more tricky to unravel, because even E will refer to God as Yahweh sometimes. But there are enough other distinctions of vocabulary and theology and geographical setting that you can usually tell whether you're reading J or E. So E has Elohim and Ephraim, hence E. It's later, again, because it does try to whitewash the characters. In its version of Abraham lying about his wife being his sister, it's rationalized so that she actually is a relative, so he's not completely lying. And or back in J, when Sarah tells Abraham to kick out Hagar, he says, look, get off my back, do whatever you want with her. But in E, he has to be convinced by God to do it. Abraham isn't that cruel. So you have that kind of zeal to cover the butts of the characters and make them look holier. Also, E doesn't have God just showing up. He speaks from the sky or in dreams or through prophets or whatever. E likes to call its religious heroes prophets, even though, like Abraham himself, even though he doesn't match either the Isaiah prototype or the Elijah stereotype. Apparently this is because it was written in the 9th century when the first prophets like Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah were active. So it's just one hint. E does not have a creation account. E begins with Father Abraham and the promises made to him. And that kind of fits the emphasis later in the book of Deuteronomy, where the concern is that God has given the promised land to his people, not as creating the world as a whole. What do they care about that? Well, E shares that focus. All right, so there's J and E. What is D? Well, that is Deuteronomy. Originally, there was what was called the Book of the Covenant, Deuteronomy, which is the 4th chapter on to the end of our Book of Deuteronomy, a book of laws, updated laws. They kept updating them all the time for obvious reasons. Things changed. And somewhere along the line, and this Book of the Covenant was written in the 6th century by a committee of prophets and priests, such as Huldah the priest, who I think was Jeremiah's aunt, and Hilkiah the priest, and something Jeremiah even was one of the writers. I don't think so, though, because he, in his own writings, he doesn't seem to care too much for the Deuteronomic reforms and so on. But at any rate, it was in the 6th century during the reign of King Josiah, and it was a manifesto for religious and economic reform, getting rid of slavery as well as Baal worship and so forth. And they figured this was a last-ditch effort to try to get God to relent and not let their foreign enemies take over. Well, somewhere along the line, by this time, J and E had been combined. That's not to say nobody still had a separate J and a separate E, but there at least was a combined version that we call JE, and somewhere somebody decided to summarize the combined JE and make it a historical prologue to the laws, so that the first 3 chapters of our book of Deuteronomy are a summary, a monarch notes of JE. You'll notice that nothing that is in the priestly account is in there. That one we haven't come to yet. That is still later. So there is a short combination of the amount of J and E that had to do with Moses, not the whole thing, but the Moses and Exodus material is, from J and E is summarized. Presumably the rest of J and E were combined too, but we don't have that, nor do we need it really. Okay, what about the P document, or the priestly code? This was a law code that is the latest of the sources. I differ from Eliot on this, and who wrote the Bible. He says P is before D. I don't think so. I still go with Wellhausen on this. P was, it began as a vast and elaborate law code, two of them in fact. I think Leviticus 17 through 26 is the holiness code, and someone based on that a larger one that supersedes it but incorporates it. That's the priestly code proper, with all kinds of laws about all kinds of things. And then someone decided to preface that with a historical prologue, only theirs went longer. They went back to creation and spanned the time between that and Moses and Aaron. But they did so in a summary fashion. There are a couple of longer stories in P, in its primordial history, but most of it is just summary. Its creation account is the 7-day creation account. 7 days because it came from Jews in the Babylonian exile trying to reinforce Jewish Sabbath worship so Jews would not assimilate to their Babylonian neighbors. So God keeps the Sabbath, that's why you should. And there were a couple of elaborate Abraham stories. There was a Noah story that was quite elaborate, and they kept that. And but most of it is summary, and then you get into all the laws. As to names of God, the priestly account also calls God names up until Moses, when it has its own story where God tells Moses, "Up to now I've been known as El Shaddai. By this name I was known to your fathers," which apparently means God Almighty. "But from now on I'm to be known as Yahweh." And so same pattern. This was written by priests who were sticklers for accuracy and statistics and so on. And it's interesting to note that one of the big differences between the J and the P Noah story is that J is full of anachronism. Just like it doesn't realize that Yahweh was a later addition to Israelite religion, and has people call God Yahweh from the beginning. In the same way, it naively pictures Noah observing kosher laws, being careful to bring only one pair of non-kosher animals on the ark, but 7 pairs of kosher ones that could be eaten and sacrificed. The priestly writer knew that such laws were introduced only with Moses, so he has Noah as a vegetarian, which he also has Adam and Eve being, and he brings only a single pair of animals. If you've ever read Genesis 6 through 9, the flood story, and wondered why it is so incredibly long and redundant, and why it contradicts itself, well, it's because you've got 2 different and complete stories spliced together. Maybe another time I'll get out a Bible that presents it that way and read them one after the other, but you can do that without missing a beat. It's 2 whole stories put right together. That's why you have contradictions between the 7-day creation account of P and the Garden of Eden story of J. It's 2 different stories just put together, in that case side by side, not spliced. The 2 versions of many of these stories, one from J, one from E, one from J, one from P, sometimes 2 from J. The compiler found 2 different ones, decided to put them both in. Well, that brings us to the question of who put these together and why. And Wellhausen's theory, if I remember right, is that Ezra the scribe, the Jewish Persian official after the exile, put together the Pentateuch pretty much as we know it. There's some thought now that there were either extensive additions made to it later, or that the whole thing was compiled later. It's a little tough to tell, but the point is in any case, to provide an ecumenical scripture for all of the Jews who either had been in the Holy Land during the exile or had come back to it from the exile. Different groups favored different pieces of sacred literature, and to get them all together as a single community, they had to put them all together. It was the same thing in early Christian times that led them to put together all four Gospels, either into, side by side usually, but over in Syria they put them together as one interwoven narrative, the diatessaron, which means through four, or from four you get one. That was exactly what someone did with J, E, D, and P. They wove them together into one massive story of creation on through Moses and the law, with all the doublets and conflations and stuff. Well, that's what we've got in the diatessaron. But people kept the four distinct Gospels. We have to unravel the Pentateuch to get back to the four sources, but it can be done easily, and it's interesting to read the result. So I think that's why you have them. They were stuck with contradictions, but they couldn't leave anything out. Suppose you say, hey, here's our new all-Israel scripture, take a look, and somebody says, hey, where's the seventh-day creation? I'm not using this thing. Hey, where's the Garden of Eden story? Forget it, keep it. No, they had to have everything in there, even if it didn't fit. Which is why it doesn't. Great stuff. I just love that, all that higher criticism. Once I came up with this hymn chorus. It was a parody of, what is it? Lord, send the old-time power, the Pentecostal power, that sinners be converted and thy name glorified. I bet some of you remember that. Well, in mine it went, Lord, send the old-time critics, the Pentateuchal critics, that sources be discovered and redactors identified. It never caught on, though. Let's see if we got anybody else in the chat room. Well, there's all kinds of interesting gossip going on there, and so forth. But here's one for us. What's with the story in Genesis about Jacob and Esau? It's just such a weird story. What with the birthright and the blessing and all that? I ask you, oh geekish one, what does it all mean? Well, these Jacob and Esau stories are what are called, by form critics, ethnological or anthropological stories. They function like editorial cartoons do today. These were stories really about clans, tribes, nations, etc. in the biblical storyteller's own day, summarizing them in the form of their eponymous ancestors, that is, an imaginary ancestor of the whole group, whose name was usually the same as the nation, sort of like Uncle Sam for U.S., United States. But Jacob was called Israel, and the nation was called Israel. Originally, my guess is that the Esau character was called Edom or Adam, but that character became the primal man in the creation account, and so the Hebrews began to take another guy, Esau, a sun god, that kind of matched these people, because the Edomites had a lot of red hair, and that was a sun symbol anyway. The Jacob stands for the people of Israel. Esau stands for the neighboring postage stamp country of Edom, and the two were related. How did they know that? Well, they had similar language and customs and religion, and they lived side by side. That was enough proof in the ancient world that you were related. But they didn't get along. They generally hated each other and fought each other. Well, the two are pictured as ethnic stereotypes. Jacob is said to be slim, trim, smooth, didn't have a lot of body hair, the Israelites in general, but they were clever. They were clever breeders and farmers and traders. They lived in tents. They had been nomads. And on the other hand, the Edomites lived out in the wild. They were hunters and bowmen. They had red hair, and it was bushy, and they were hairy generally. And so they and according to the Israelites, the Edomites were stupid. And so you got Esau pictured as sort of a big, dumb Jethro Bodine type. And so the stories try to explain the history of the two groups, that the people of Israel had not been there as long. They were the younger group, probably started as an offshoot or something. So they got to be the second son. But they're closer to God in their own mind anyway, so they have to be the favorite son. And at the time the story was told, they had, which might have been the time of King David, who knows, they had subjugated the Edomites, as David was said to have done. Again, archaeology throws all this stuff into a cocked hat. I don't know what to make of that, but, the old-time religion allows it. Apparently it's in the time when Israel has subjugated Edom, and so they have to explain why. The Edomites are mightier and older and hardier in some ways. Well, our common ancestor, Isaac, was cheated into giving the priority to the younger son. The lion's share of the property and of the blessing of success would have gone by rights to the first son, primogenitor. The blessings and curses in the ancient world were believed to have power behind them. They weren't just formalities. It was thought that these words would not come back void, and so if you were given a blessing, it would happen. That's why Esau is so upset when he foolishly trades his birthright blessing to his brother because he's famished and wants some of the lentil stew. Hard to imagine anybody wanting that Jacob has just cooked up. He's stupid enough that he's willing to say anything. It's not going to do me any good if I'm dead of hunger. And then later on, this is just, again, another version of the same idea. He somehow still has the firstborn's birthright, but is cheated out of it this time with this hilarious story with Esau being out hunting the game that Isaac wants, and their mother cooking it up, sending in Jacob wearing goat skins to simulate the furriness of Isaac, who apparently was Bigfoot, and he thinks it is Esau and gives him Esau's blessing, and he can't retract it. Well, apparently they're both just both stories are trying to explain why the younger, less powerful group nonetheless rules the older, more powerful one. And then once Esau says, "Do you have only one blessing, my father?" And he says, "Well, come to think of it, I could at least say this, after a while you will break his yoke from your shoulders." Well, why this afterthought? Well, the story had to be changed because history changed. During the time of Solomon, we're told the Edomites broke away and regained their independence. Did Isaac's blessing return to him void? Well, no, he anticipated that too. The story had to be revised in the light of current events. That's why you also have this later story where Abraham and Isaac, where Jacob and Esau reconcile. That seems to represent a still later period when they got together, the two groups, and intermarried. That didn't last too long either, though, because the Edomites took vengeance on Israel, or Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar stomped Jerusalem in 586. So the relations of these two groups, and there are other stories about Israel versus the Moabites and the Ammonites and so on too, but this is more prominent. It's also based on the story of Cronus and Uranus being overthrown by their children, but I don't want to get into that. That's yet another whole thing. But that's basically what the Jacob and Esau stories are. They're trying to explain in narrative form current political events and such. Here's a goodie. Philosophos says, it's refreshing to hear a non-believer express such enthusiasm about the Bible. I'm curious, what is it about the Bible that you find interesting and that is lacking from other traditions? In other words, what's great about the Judeo-Christian tradition that keeps you coming back, as opposed to, say, Hesiod's Theology or Ovid's Metamorphoses? Oh, well, the answer there is simple. It's just my biography. I just was brought up in Christianity, and the further I got into it, of course, the less of a believer I was, but I found you could get much more deeply into it, and that's just fascinating. I love fiction, I love narrative, I love myth, and I do love these other traditions too, the Greeks. In fact, you realize very quickly that there's a lot of common material between the Old Testament, the Theology, the Metamorphoses, and loads of other stuff. So I just love it all. Plus the Quran, I've studied that a good bit. I've written some about the Book of Mormon, Buddhist mythology and stuff. I love that. It's just all great stuff. I know most about the Bible, though, just because of what I've chosen to spend my time on, because of what my background is, but it's all terrific stuff, and all on the same level pretty much. It's all got good, what would you say, some edifying, uplifting stuff, and it's got a lot of nonsense in it too, as you would expect. It's ancient stuff. And let's see. Oh, any more? Yeah, here's another goodie. Is it fair to assume that most of the stories in the Bible were passed down orally for generations before ever being penned? Yeah, I think it certainly is. And let me give you one exception to that in a moment, a counter consideration, but I think surely it is. And one of the big reasons for thinking that it's ultimately transcribed oral tradition. I know some would say anal tradition, but oral tradition is because of these several different versions of things. When you're reading along in Genesis, and in chapter 12, you got Abram and Sarai going into Egypt, and where they run afoul of Pharaoh, and doesn't say which one, and Abraham is so afraid that his wife is so beautiful, Pharaoh's going to add her to his harem and kill him to get to her. He says, well, let's just tell him you're my sister. That way he'll still be screwing you, but I won't get killed. Real upstanding guy. Well, then you're reading along some chapters later, and now it's Abraham and Sarah, slightly different versions of the names, and they go into Gerar in Philistia, and this time it's Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, but the same thing happens. And then you're reading a few chapters later, and this time it's Isaac and Rebekah, and they're going, with, of course, the son and daughter-in-law of Abraham and Sarah, and they go to Gerar of the Philistines and meet King Abimelech, and it's the same thing again. What is this? What's going on? Well, obviously, what's happened is it's just like telling a joke. The story was just told mouth to ear for who knows how long. I don't know if you can tell how long, but it was certainly orally transmitted, and people can't keep the details straight. Names especially, unless you're talking about some famous person, you're never going to keep the name straight in a joke, but even if you are talking about a famous person, it's hard to remember which one. How often have you heard quotes attributed to all different people? Well, same thing. This has all the different feeding stories in the Gospels. How many people were there? 4,000 or 5,000? How many baskets were there? And so on. Well, they can't keep the details straight. Nobody can, and things like that. They just know there are thousands of people and there's not much food. And so you have different versions of it being passed around, and Mark hears them both and figures, well, they're both sacred material. I guess I better not choose. I better put them both in. And there's lots of things like that. And so I think that's one sign that it was orally transmitted. Another is the economy with which the stories are told. Now, two different things happen with oral tradition. Sometimes, if it's told many, many times, it gets whittled down, and all you have in the story is what you need for the story to make sense. But other times, there's a lot of embellishment, and so different stories might have changed a good bit. Like Bultmann thought that the story of the healing of the centurion's servant and from Q and the Markan story of the Syro-Phoenician woman and her demon-possessed daughter were originally the same story, and the people just elaborated the details. Well, that sounds very likely to me. And in the Johannine stream, it becomes the Basilikos, the royal official of the Herodian court, not a Roman centurion. So that happens too. Sometimes it elaborates and gets embellished in transmission. But either way, those are marks of oral transmission. Sometimes you have very different techniques involved with one writer taking a text and redoing it. Thomas Brodie has done a lot of great work on this with how Luke in the Gospel and the Book of Acts has broken up loads of stories from the Deuteronomic history, that is Joshua through Kings, especially Elijah and Elisha stories, and made Jesus stories out of them by reshuffling the elements of the stories. Fascinating stuff. That's more likely to happen, I think, with a writer using a written text. I've done an article in a book called A Feminist Companion to the Book of Acts, edited by Amy Jill Levine. I think T&T Clark published it. You'd think I'd know with my own stuff. And in it, I think the thing's called, my article's called Two More Cases of Luke's Suppression of Women. And I give reasons for thinking that the prodigal son parable, Luke's creation in any case, is a reshuffling of the Penelope suitors sequence from the Odyssey. And it's chopped up in a way you wouldn't have in oral transmission, but rather it's one writer using another's work. Let's see here. Someone, Norm mentions a likely, a good song here, Amazing Wrath, a chorus of the cries of unbelievers in an eternal hell. When we've been there 10 billion years, burning body, limb, and tongue, we'll have no less years to scream in tears than when we first begun. I did a Lovecraftian version of that song once. Did you know, by the way, that you can sing Amazing Grace to the tune of Mickey Mouse and vice versa? It works real well. A-M-A-Z-I-N-G-R-A-Z. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Amazing grace, amazing grace, how sweet the sound, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. A-M-A-Z-I-N-G-R-A-Z. It's pretty edifying, actually. Ooh, let's see. Master Zap says, I'm back to those things Ezekiel saw, and then get a rerun in Revelation. Is it possible to make heads or tails of what the dude is describing? It's very detailed, yet only partially coherent, in my humble opinion. Yeah, I think that basically what you have is a kind of portable version, without being facetious, of the throne of Yahweh situated above the heavenly firmament. It's as if somehow there's been a miniature picture taken of it and made into a duplicate so that he sees what is like the real firmament upon which Yahweh's throne is erected is blue sapphire because of the sky, and it's held up on mountains. The firmament is that go way down below the ocean above which the earth is elevated in the biblical cosmology. But here it's held up by moving cherubim. These are personifications of the clouds upon which Yahweh as a storm god rides. So it's sort of combining the image of Yahweh's throne chariot. Baal Hadad in Syria was depicted the same way, and also Yahweh's throne period sitting above the waters upon the sapphire firmament of the sky. And it's as, for some reason, it's combining them. I don't know why. It would make more sense to me if it simply had him in the chariot, supported by the cherubim, the clouds personified. And they in turn reflect Babylonian iconography with the different faces and so forth. And there was this guy, this NASA engineer, that said that this is a pretty good candidate for a guy actually seeing a spacecraft and describing it in ancient terms. I'm open to that. I know that sounds nutty, but I do not want to be confined to traditionalism. From what I've read of this book, the guy seems to know what he's talking about. I don't rule anything out. And I'm not a believer in that, but I don't want to be closed-minded. I don't think you need flying saucers to account for that story. I've just accounted for it in terms of ancient mythology and iconography, but it's worth keeping your finger at that page of the book. It's a fascinating theory, but I do think that is what's going on there. In fact, I think when Jesus is made to say in the Gospels that you will see him coming with the clouds, I think it's, as Margaret Barker said, Jesus is there, really the Old Testament Yahweh on his cloud chariot, that he's descending from heaven in it. Who was the first theologian to proclaim that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God? I guess I would give that honor probably to Origen in the late 2nd century, or early 3rd, I guess it was, in Alexandria. He wasn't the first Christian to think that the Old Testament was inspired. That seems like whoever wrote the 2 Timothy, all Scripture is inspired by God, etc. But that's a reference to the Old Testament, and Philo says the same sort of thing about the Old Testament, that God used the writers like a musician uses a flute and so on. So this had already been said about the Old Testament by Jews and Christians of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, if not earlier. But early Christians before Origen regarded what we call the New Testament books as important, not as inspired books, but as authoritative witnesses to the earliest preaching. In fact, Hans Kung and others have said that still ought to be the way we look at them. But they believe that they were apostolic, whether in the strict or the looser sense of coming from the apostolic generation. And so these are foundational documents by authoritative teachers. But as I believe it's correct that Origen was the first one to say, no, these books, like the Old Testament books, are the result of divine theopneustos, God-breathing. The Upanishads speak of the Vedas as being breathed forth by Brahman, I think, the same image. And he's the first one that said we must determine which books are in a New Testament canon. Everybody, at least in the emerging Catholic Church, had a basic list with some gray area. Even Eusebius said it was undecided as yet. But Origen said, we better decide, though, because a book is either inspired or it's not. It could be more or less authoritative, but it's either inspired or it's not. And so because only inspired books can be read allegorically. They're not simply human writings. It was just the opposite of what Martin Luther would say. Luther later said that yes, inspired by God, but what is it that's inspired by God? A human writing, and we know how those are to be read. The same way you would read an uninspired human writing. You don't get your Little Orphan Annie decoder ring out. Well, Origen thought, no, because it's inspired, there are other levels of meaning, and so we'd better get clear on which of the books amenable to such treatment, and so forth. That didn't settle the issue, but that lent some urgency. I believe Origen was the first to say that the New Testament books, whatever they all turn out to be, are also inspired. However, inerrancy is yet another problem, because if there's more than one level at which the Bible teaches, you've got to ask, well, where would I look for the Bible to be correct? And he said it doesn't entail factual inerrancy on a literal level. He said that the Old Testament is filled with statements that are not factually correct and not supposed to be. He said, for instance, no adult believes that a snake spoke to a guy in the Garden of Eden. And he said even the Gospels, though they're basically historically accurate, Origen said, still have thousands of such places where you can't take it literally. And he says you're not supposed to, and you're supposed to say, hey, a contradiction, oh boy, that shows me I have to look deeper. Well, that's the beginning of a lot of mischief, but in another way, it's a healthy view of the Bible. You're not locked into the crazy inerrancy harmonizations. Of course, he was doing nothing the Stoics hadn't done already with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that's where Jews and Christians got it. They had their own problems with the way the gods were depicted in their scriptures, and so they've said, well, if you approach them as allegories, you can get something noble out of it, and Jews and Christians did the same. Bail the Bible out of looking bad sometimes. Does the New Testament view of resurrection express the conviction that human life is inseparable from bodily experience? I guess it does, because I suppose the question for me would be, if you believed in a Platonic idea of the pure survival of the soul, what would that be like if you existed but without any sort of bodily limits? Would you appear to yourself to have personality limits? I don't know. That's harder to imagine. I think the resurrection thing, whether you're looking at the synoptic gospel, well, the gospel view, all of them, having Jesus, and by extension others, in fleshly bodies, still with deformities, or you look at the 1 Corinthians view, which appears to adopt the old view from Enoch and other Jubilees and so on, that those who rise from the dead will basically become angels. I think either way you have some sort of confinement to an identifiable form, and that is probably why they figured that, what is to identify one without a body. It's almost like the Aristotelian thing that the factor that makes objects differ is not their form but their matter, the slightly different instantiations of the same form. I would guess that somehow underlies it. Master Zapp asks, when did this nonsense of the Trinity first pop up? And what did they smoke to come up with that? Actually, I would have a little more regard for the Trinity doctrine if it had been the result of a drug-induced sacred hallucination. But as it is, it seems to me that the Trinity is an unfortunate set of inferences from Christian worship that was implicitly polytheistic. Again, as Margaret Barker argues in a couple of really mind-expanding books, and by the way, I have never been much interested in drugs because I've found books to be more than sufficiently mind-expanding. And in her books, The Older Testament and The Great Angel and various others, Barker shows that Israel not only began with polytheistic worship, but continued to embrace it on a popular level on into the 1st century, and that the roots of that may be the roots of the Trinity, that Jesus was understood to be Yahweh making a theophanic appearance on earth, as he had done often in the Old Testament when people see the angel of Yahweh, and that the father of Jesus was El Elyon, God Most High. Think of how the demons say, why have you come to plague us? We know who you are, Jesus, Son of God Most High. And the Spirit would be the same as the Shekinah or wisdom, originally Isis, and so forth. What happened is, whether you think it's a survival of Israelite polytheism or simply the fact that people began to worship Jesus alongside God, that began in Christian times, you seem to have had Christians worshiping more than one entity. And they said, look, we don't want to be considered polytheists, though. Judaism is officially monotheistic. We should be too. And so how can we get to have one God and yet continue to worship Father, Son, and Spirit? Or more than that if you were a Gnostic. And so they focused the debate on the great Arian controversy. Granted that Jesus is the incarnation of the Logos of God, the Word, was that Word of identical essence with the Father or of similar essence? Was he another attribute or personification of God's own nature alongside the Creator? Or was he a creation through which everything else was created? You can find both, I think, in the Old Testament with wisdom. And so they voted in favor of the notion that the Father and the Son were different personae who shared the same divine nature, and then the Holy Spirit is easily folded into that, and the Trinity becomes official in Christianity as of 325 AD with the Council of Nicaea. It's not as if no one had ever heard of it. In the late 2nd century, Tertullian is already speaking of the three personae, and so it was in the works, but it seems to have become the official doctrine as of the Council of Nicaea. You cannot accurately say it's in the New Testament simply because you have triadic language, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Though that's a bad example, that probably, as Eusebius implies, is a post-Nicene interpolation into Matthew. But even in the epistles, often it says, "May the grace of God and of Jesus and of the Holy Spirit be with you." Well, that's not the Trinity. That's the kind of stuff that's going to lead people to ask the question. But the Trinity is a complex philosophical model. I think an untenable one, but it first surfaced in Christianity in the late 2nd, early 3rd century. A lot of great questions. Philosophos says, I have a lot of trouble finding any solid evidence in the Bible which is clearly against abortion. Where do modern right-leaning Christians get this from biblically? And if there's no good biblical foundation for this, do they get this from some earlier tradition? What's your best guess as to where this ultimately comes from? Well, it isn't in the Bible. It never comes up in the Bible, which is almost a surprise because, of course, they did have abortions in the ancient world, various techniques, and somewhat dangerous. But as far as we know, it was the early Christian view. There could have been debates about it. I don't know, though. But the Apocalypse of Peter, a late 1st or early 2nd century work, is unforgiving on abortionists and says that it goes into disgusting detail about women who got abortions and what torments they will endure in hell. The Epistle of Barnabas and the Didache are pretty negative, condemning abortion. So early Christians were against abortion and infanticide, which served them well in terms of the growth of their movement. And so I don't know. I guess the question for me would be, when did any friendliness toward abortion appear in the Christian tradition? I just don't know enough about it. It isn't biblical, but it is an early Christian view, if not the early Christian view. My guess is that modern political fundamentalists don't really get into that so much. They're just inferring, understandably, from the commandment, you shall not murder, that abortion would be considered murder because they believe the fetus is enough of a person to have rights, that if left alone it will become what all will recognize as a person and does have rights. In fact, I must admit I agree with that thinking. I do think that, generally speaking, abortion is murder. I'm afraid I have to forfeit my liberal membership card on that one. I've taught this in ethics classes for years, representing both sides, and I must say trying to see it the pro-abortion, pro-choice way. I cannot see any argument for abortion that would not also legitimate infanticide. So, but I admit that, well, first of all, it doesn't matter to me what the Bible might say about it. That would not settle the issue. But I don't think it's even in the Bible. So I just say all this to let you know I'm not just trying to give these people trouble, that I think anti-abortionists are the bad guys, so let me heap any kind of opprobrium on them I can. No. I think they're probably right on this one, but by accident. But they're drawing an inference from the Bible that is understandable, but that's all it is. It certainly doesn't make that explicit. Please recommend a harmony of the Gospels, Norm asks. I want to be careful not to get one that has been whitewashed by evangelical, apologetical, pseudo-scholarship. Do you know one that is just a column-by-column match of the Gospels? There are various ones, but my favorite that I still use is Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels. If anything, Throckmorton's bias, if any, doesn't show up in that work, and he does have the synoptics with Mark in the middle, and when he follows Mark, but then repeats sections when it's more helpful to look at the Q version, and it's easy to find stuff. There's a table of contents. He's got great footnotes where he supplies parallels from the Agrapha in the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John. There are other types of gospel parallels or gospel harmonies. One is a Johannine synopsis of the Gospels, which has the continuous text of John. I can see it on my shelf. I cannot make out who the author is and don't want to get up and find out and leave dead air, but the title is the Johannine Synopsis of the Gospels. And there are some other ones, and I don't think there's really any apologetics concerns that affect how these things are depicted. It seems to me if you're an apologist, you just would not want people looking at such things, because this has destroyed the fundamentalism of many people. They've just never noticed the differences between the Gospels, how one writer rewords another. But that's a goodie, and I think Throckmorton's he's the same guy that did a politically correct, inclusive language version of the New Testament, which strikes me as an unfortunate product. It's kind of strange, but this is a good work and still in print, so I think it's a real helpful one. Muad'Dib, going under his title of the Kwisatz Haderach, the universe's super being, says, what do you think the Ancient of Days was? Some say it was God himself. Some people are even saying it was some kind of manna machine. Reminds me of a Ruddles song somehow. Anyway, can you talk about Ezekiel's wheel? Don't really know what the wheel is, unless that is the same as the throne chariot of God. Some have said it's a flying saucer. I have to admit that's a pretty convincing one if you want ancient documentary evidence a la Velikovsky, so I couldn't close the door on that one. The Ancient of Days, though, to me, that's in Daniel 7. That is a really valuable passage in which you have a series of monsters arising out of the primordial ocean. They are the equivalent of Tiamat, Leviathan, Behemoth, and so forth, the chaos dragons of the deep. And then they are overcome implicitly by one like a son of man, that is human in appearance. He is Yahweh, who has beaten the dragons to create the world, and he now is given authority by El Elyon, the father of the gods, hence the Ancient of Days, the elder god, and he passes world sovereignty on to the younger one, the Son of Man, Yahweh, the mighty man of war. This old creation account has been used by the writer of Daniel in the 2nd century BC as a kind of political allegory, the monsters representing different heathen empires, the Son of Man representing the saints of the Most High, of the people of Judah. But originally what he's using is an old creation account in which the Ancient of Days, or as the book of Enoch calls him, the head of days, the chief of days, the oldest one, he is El Elyon, the father of the gods, who yields his reign to the more vigorous Yahweh, just as Ea did to Marduk, and El did to Baal, and Varuna did to Indra, and so forth in the other mythologies. Assuming that the Jesus described in the New Testament actually existed, what do you think would be his response if he were to reappear today and walk into a Christian church? Do you think he would know what was happening? How do you think Christians in the church would respond to Jesus? Well, maybe by showing him the door. There's a bunch of jokes and other stories based on this. One of them Jesus shows up at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and this priest on duty there recognizes him from the stained glass windows, and he goes back into the back real quick and talks to the cardinal. He says, "Your Holiness, you're not going to believe it, but it's Jesus Christ out there. What do we do?" The cardinal says, "Look busy." That's one, and there's a similar Moses story where God sends Mo down from heaven to a yeshiva, and he hears these guys frantically arguing over fine points of Torah and Halakha, and he goes back to heaven and says to God, what is this, an insane asylum? What are they talking about? He says, "Don't you recognize your own Torah?" Trying to emphasize how it's changed over the years. There's all kinds of quips one hears. If Jesus came into a Baptist church he could never join, that long-haired hippie stuff, and hard to imagine Jesus signing a creed. Of course, the greatest example of dealing with this is the parable of the Grand Inquisitor, in the Brothers Karamazov of Dostoevsky, where Jesus shows up in, I think it's 13th century Spain, and the Inquisition grabs him and throws him in a jail cell, and he's due to be burned at the stake the next day. And the Grand Inquisitor comes in and he says, "I know who you are. It's taken us all these centuries to undo your mischief. You tried to liberate humanity and to get them to bear the great burden of freedom. But don't you see, people don't want that. You left and we offered them what they want. We gulled them with mystery, miracle, and authority. They want to be told what to think. They want to mortgage their souls to Mother Church, so that's what we've done. We've done them a favor. We're their friends, not you. We're not going to let you come back and torment them again and undo what we've done to undo your mischief, so tomorrow you're going to burn." Jesus says nothing during the whole scene, and finally the guy says, "I used to look at it the way you do. I remember that kind of idealism. Too bad it doesn't work in this world." But finally he's sort of a softy and opens the jail door and says to Jesus, "All right, just get out of town and don't come back." And Jesus walks into the night. What an astounding parable. I'd like to think of a Jesus like that. Who knows what he was like, but I rather imagine it would be kind of like at Wheaton College, where they have a room set aside as a shrine to C.S. Lewis, and they have his desk there where he wrote all of his great books. And I remember sitting there once thinking, boy, what a privilege. Poor Lewis couldn't get a job at Wheaton College if he bribed him because he didn't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. Oh, boy. Someone said, though this is not in red, but luckily I've seen it anyway. You said last week that the Moonies were unfairly criticized. I thought they were a notorious cult for separating young people from their families and brainwashing them. I've known Moonies for 30 years. I've known mainly graduate students. Maybe they're different from the run-of-the-mill, but they all were run-of-the-mill, selling flowers and witnessing. I don't see much different between them and Campus Crusade members, except that their dedication is such they decided to live together in harsh circumstances, much like a convent or a monastery. they certainly are not brainwashed. There's at least some Moonies, especially on the West Coast, employed manipulative tactics to sort of make you feel part of a big loving group, and then once you're aboard, they start hitting you with all the theology. But that's no different really than church retreats that invite other kids along and suck them in. And in fact, the Moonies and all such so-called cult groups have an over 95% turnover rate. There's almost nobody stays in it for very long, so they certainly are not confined. They try to keep them away from family and old friends, but only in the same way that fundamentalist churches suggest that you try to associate with your new family, much as Jesus says about his family in Mark chapter 3. There are things about them I don't care for, but the Moonies I've known, professors and theologians of theirs, and the grad students, their charitable workers and so on, have impressed me no little over many years, and I'm proud to have Moonie friends. I'm sure there's stuff you can point out wrong with all denominations, but to me that's just, I have friends among the Mormons. I certainly don't agree with their theology either, but it's not a question of that. I approach these things as a scholar and an anthropologist, and I try to be friendly with whoever I meet and not make them into bad guys. So I think a lot of the Moonies and the Mormons. Let's see here. Yeah, there it is again in red. Thanks for going to that trouble. I noticed Norm points out that in a story I wrote many years ago called Saucers from Yadith, the character corresponding to myself joins in a group of occult seekers in taking a hallucinogenic drug to induce visions of the saucers from Yadith. Even there, I paint myself as a religious fanatic who has to be argued into doing it, but in fact I never have. I've always been a nice nerd and a sissy, and so I have never experimented with it. Oh boy, when will your shows not available at Info Guy be possible to download? I have to admit I've been so busy the last couple of weeks with other pressing things, course planning and lecture writing and stuff. I just haven't gotten around to figuring out how to do that. I know it's easy, but I hope within the next couple of weeks to have them all up there. I've recorded all of them, and I hope to have them available, and I just don't quite know how to do it at the moment, but I'm sure it won't take long. And I'm sure my wife and I can figure it out with some help from Reg. And I'll have them up. I'm really sorry they should have been up long before now. Let's see. Master Zap comments going back to Ezekiel's visions and the firmament. I always interpreted that description as trying to describe some form of transparent canopy, as indeed it does, but I think that is what it's based on, the sapphire firmament of the heavens. The weirdest bit in the description are those wheels, though, that seem to follow without being connected in some bizarre fashion. I think that's just a kind of pointless remnant of the basic image that it's the throne chariot drawn by the cherubim. So it's like an odd thing. It just catalogs some features of the firmament of the sky with the throne of God and the chariot that bears the throne, and it either I don't quite understand it because not enough of the ancient background survives, or it's perhaps just somewhat confused. I wouldn't presume to say. It's a toughie. Let's see. This is the Bible Geek, Robert M. Price, and here doing my best to either answer your questions or pretend that I'm... No, actually, if I don't understand, I'll say so and buckle down and do some research. Another one of these things I feel like I got to report to you. I'm thinking of writing a column about this, but I just love to read the theology of bumper stickers and church message boards. Often the message boards are so pathetically bland. It's like just telling some folks like me, don't bother showing up, but I really get a kick out of them when they try to get cute. And around here I noticed one where it said, God will be here Sunday, February so-and-so at 11 o'clock, come and see him. Because right down the street, the McDonald's has Elmo will be here at so-and-so time, come have your picture taken with him. Or Scooby-Doo after that. I think it's the Teletubbies or somebody that's showing up this time. And I thought, if I went to McDonald's, I'd at least see something that looks like Elmo. Though I guess there really isn't an Elmo. But would I even see a guy in a God suit if I went to the Baptist church? And it struck me, it's like the great elephant that's not in the room. I remember this occurred to me when I was going to a conservative Baptist church in high school many years ago. There I was gustily singing the hymns, etc., and praying along with them and all that stuff. And I thought, gee, look at all this stuff we're doing, as if this is a welcoming parade for a visiting dignitary, but he ain't here. I thought, why doesn't he show up? Why is he never here? Why are we always acting as if he's here? But it's really like Bela Lugosi in this movie, The Invisible Ghost, where the guy's wife has died and he just can't accept it. So he sets a place for her and pours her some soup every day, and he's there as if she's there. How do you like your soup? And so forth. Is that the way it is? Like, are we just kidding ourselves that there is a God? And it just brings up a big question of, what are you supposed to be believing about that? I think of the Psalms where the writer says, "Thus have I beheld thee in the sanctuary to see thy power and glory." What was he talking about? Did they actually have visions? Isaiah. And was he having a hallucination, or was he just sort of assuming God was there? Or is it one of these things that Durkheim talked about with totemism, that the mass hysteria of the group meeting somehow conjures up the sense that there's a God? I don't know. Interesting stuff I need to explore more, but because you got to ask why people don't more often notice that the elephant's not in the room. But I don't know, maybe I should leave that to the church signboard geek. Anyway, let's see, Dan Ross from Maine again says, I was wondering about the stories of the Exodus, the desert wanderings, and conquest of the Holy Land, I guess. Since it seems that the Israelites were just Canaanites who liberated themselves, why is it that when it came time to write the history, they chose enslavement in Egypt and years of desert wandering rather than something a bit more glorious? Are there any good theories out there? Well, yeah, more than I know, I'm sure. Some I vaguely am aware of, but here's what I think about it. It may be that some clans belonging to Ephraim in the north, the Ephraim and Manasseh clans, the so-called sons of Joseph, right? There was a tribe of, Joseph was one of the sons, hence one of the tribes of Israel, but they had half tribes to replace him, Ephraim and Manasseh, named after his two sons. And the whole story of Israel having been in Egypt is predicated on the story of Joseph, the Hebrew Osiris. And given the business about bringing the mummy of Joseph back during the Exodus and all that, and given the fact that some Levites in the Old Testament have Egyptian-derived names, such as Moses himself, some have suggested that though Israel as a whole was never in Egypt, there may have been progenitors or ancestors of some clans, at least in those tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, who had sojourned in Egypt. Now, when the tribes formed their federation, their Amphictyony, I think I'm pronouncing that right, but I've never heard anybody pronounce it, so I welcome your correction. When they formed their union of tribes, well, it was rather like, naturalized American citizens born in Sri Lanka or Uganda saying, well, our first president was George Washington, the father of our country. Well, of course, they're right, because they're Americans now. Well, in the same way, if you were a member of Zebulun, now the ancestors of Ephraim were yours too. So it may be that way in which they eventually came to believe that all their ancestors had been in Egypt. But then it may be none of them had, and the idea of their being enslaved and then liberated from Egypt reflects much later historical developments. The Old Testament scholar Garbini has suggested that the Egypt thing may reflect Jewish relations with the Ptolemaic Empire after Alexander the Great. That they got along well there, but then things got hot and so forth. I don't know all the details, but that's not impossible. That fits, of course, these post-Wellhausen theories that the documents are all much, much later, much more recent. It's kind of hard to say, really, and the date of the documents does have a lot to do with the historical substance of them. The idea of the wanderings, though, this is yet another piece of the puzzle. What point were they trying to make by having them, the Israelites, wander aimlessly in the Sinai wilderness for 40 years, like on F Troop, the Hakawi Indians, right? Where'd you get your name? Well, we went on a long trip and lost the compass, and we said, we're the Hakawi. Is that the way it was? Well, no, you see, what happens is that originally, as Jeremiah says, the wilderness wanderings period was considered to be a honeymoon between Israel and God, because these people were wandering nomads. They neither had nor wanted any permanent city, any more than Arab Bedouins do today. So there was no problem. It wasn't like they were headed somewhere, but somehow there was some kind of Star Trek force field at Kadesh Barnea that was keeping them out of Canaan for 40 years, and then God zapped it down. No, originally those stories where they go from Massa and Meribah to this place and that place, and they meet these kings and those guys and so on. This is just part of the great story of the nomads of Israel, which has to do with Cain and Abel. Abel is a shepherd, hence symbolizes the nomads. Why does God prefer his offering to that of Cain, who is a Canaanite farmer? Simply because Abel is an Israelite nomad. There's nothing about motives or sincerity or anything. But these stories had to be sewn into a larger narrative, one based off of the Abraham stories, where God had, of course, stories that began in Palestine among Israelites that said God gave this land to us. The same kind of real estate bickering we have in the Middle East today. Well, the Moses stories were connected with that, so that you had to envision the Israelites trying to get to a promised land. Now, originally, the promises to Abraham don't imply they're going to leave. I mean, the Deuteronomic redactor has added a lot of obviously interpolated stuff about 450 years from now, your descendants are going to come back. But originally, the point is that Abe, Ike, and Jake and their descendants will have this land. They're not going to leave it and come back. So you've had to harmonize the Egyptian stuff with that, and the Sinai nomad wanderings, which did not presuppose they were trying to get anywhere. Moses originally was a character presiding over the nomads. He had nothing to do with the Abraham stories or the settlement of Canaan, so they couldn't very well have him go into Canaan. They just didn't belong there, so they had to come up with some kind of expedient to keep him out when his people went in. Hence the utter arbitrary character of this crazy story, where Everybody is complaining about the thirst, and God says, well, why don't you go speak to the rock and it'll gush forth water? And he gets so mad he hits the rock with his staff, and he gets the water, but God said, hey, listen, buddy, I told you to speak to it, not to hit it. I mean, what kind of a God is this? Just for that, you're not going into the promised land. It's ridiculous. Right? It's just they had to come up with something. They couldn't make Moses a real sinner, though, right? So it couldn't be anything that would deserve a real punishment. But God turns out looking like a peevish jerk, as he does quite often for literary purposes. So once you realize how these things were put together, a lot of weird connections start making sense. They don't have sufficient narrative motivation. They don't sound natural as part of a story. But you can see why it sounds unnatural. The writer or redactor had painted himself into a corner. What to do with a fundamentalist office mate who is full tilt, witnessing someone who has a self-sealing premise. Thought out everything you've got to say and have a lame argument for it. Dan Ross says that his friend sounds like something of a presuppositionalist also, a maddeningly illogical approach to apologetics. I have an article, I'm not sure if it's up, I'll try to get it up on my site, called On Having Your Head Up Your Assumptions, which deals with presuppositionalism. I don't know if it's much help, but it's an attempt to. He also asks, should he get a copy of Beyond Born Again for his friend? I wish you could, but my first book is out of print. It is supposed to be coming out in a revised edition from Wildside Press soon, but it's taken forever. I don't know when it'll be out. The original edition is available on the secular web under my name. If you want to just give him the address or print it out for him, that's okay by me. I hope soon, though, to have actual copies available for people, though. Let's see. Richard Hughes in Asbury, New Jersey, Methodistville, says, I listen religiously to the Bible Geek. I'm always fascinated by the doctrines of the various Bible scholars, both critics and apologists. While I've managed to wade through a few of the books you've recommended, and get this, he really has done a great job here. Paine's Age of Reason, Strauss's Life of Jesus, critically examined, well, most of it anyway, he says. Loafing's The Bible, Now I Get It, a form criticism handbook, as well as Beyond Born Again, Deconstructing Jesus and the Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. The human lifespan, barring a great leap forward in medical science, may not allow me enough time to get through everything I'd like to read. Could you recommend any book or books that would best present a brief but comprehensive history of biblical criticism, the scholars and their theories? Well, brief is the toughie there. I would recommend a 2-volume set from Fortress Press, came out just a few years ago, by the author Baird, B-A-I-R-D. I think it's J. Arthur Baird. I forget. Once again, I see it over there on the shelf, but I know it's Baird. It's called History of New Testament Research. 2 volumes, and it does go into all of that. Now, that's only the New Testament. With the Old Testament, you're talking about a huge continent of stuff. Yet even there is a good book to suggest. It's not a short one, though. Otto Eisfeld did an Old Testament introduction that I believe was published by Harper and Row when they were Harper and Row. I think it's just the Old Testament and introduction, and it's organized by the different writings, but it goes into, the succession of theories. That's kind of dense stuff, but I guess anything with any kind of detail would be. Baird probably is too. Another one that is kind of slow going, but it's worth looking at, is Werner Georg Kummel. Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R, Georg, like George without the E on the end of it, and Kummel, K-U-M-M-E-L, with the 2 dots over the U. This book came out from Abingdon. I think it's in print, but if it isn't, it should be readily available on Advanced Book Exchange or Bookfinder.com or one of these things. It's called The New Testament, The History of the Investigation of Its Problems. Yeah, and that one is a long book, hundreds of pages. It's a little bit dated now. It doesn't go up into some of the latest stuff with sociology and anthropology, rhetorical criticism and all that, which I find a bit less interesting anyway. But it does cover all the classical stuff, and it slows you down because there's a lot of hefty chunks of quoted material translated from the critics, but that's a good thing. So it's not going to be easy reading, but it is a handy chronicle of all this material. A well-known history of New Testament criticism is that by Stephen Neale, an Anglican bishop, and that one is the interpretation of the New Testament, I think 1861 to 1961. That's a good book, but it's very slanted toward a conservative standpoint. It dismisses Bauer and the Tübingen School in a way I find gratuitous and absurd, as I discussed last week. And there's probably shorter ones that are more balanced, but I can't think of them offhand. Good stuff, all those. Joe Hamed in Huntington, West Virginia says, where might I purchase a copy of your book, Jesus Christ Superstar, a redactional study of a modern gospel? Well, that one was supposed to come out from Wildside, but I'm negotiating with another publisher now, it probably, if they do it, it will come out with a slightly different title, Jesus Christ Superstar, the making of a modern gospel. And I don't know, I imagine it would be in a year's time or so, but I'm waiting to hear the final editorial verdict on that one. And I hope you like it. I do. Recently went over the whole thing and added quite a bit of material to it, and I think it's going to be a fun book. Norm mentioned something I hinted at a couple of weeks ago, that I might be interested in doing a second weekly show if there's enough time for it. Perhaps an ongoing study of the Gospel of Thomas or some other text, maybe myths in the book of Genesis or something. I haven't gotten much feedback. This, I think, is the first I have gotten. I would like to know more of your opinions on that, if it's worth doing. I think it would be a lot of fun. But let me hear some more feedback from you on that. Greg Gauthier, no, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing it. He says it should be pronounced Gauthier, okay, from Grays Lake, Illinois, says he'd been reading The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and was wondering if I wouldn't mind briefly discussing some of the problems posed by the various critical criterion I detail in the introduction and first chapter, and particularly the idea that if you have two different versions of what seems to be the same story, and one is more spectacular than the other, the less spectacular one is going to be the one more likely historical. Might be that neither of them are, but it seems very unlikely both could be. And if you're going to go with probability, which is more probably accurate? Well, the less spectacular one. And just one that occurs to me here is the walking on the water. The original with Jesus walking on the water is pretty astounding, right? I would say that did not happen. It's a legend, like a Buddhist legend and a Pythagorean legend. But when you compare it to the one where in Matthew it's not only Jesus but then Peter walking on the water, you got to ask yourself, now, which version is earlier? Well, it would just have to be the one where it's Jesus alone. Ask yourself, if you knew the story was of Jesus and his disciple both walking on the water, would you ever edit the story so that it's just Jesus? It's hard to imagine. Why reduce the astonishing element of a story, a miracle story, told in order to astonish and impress readers? Whereas if you had a story of Jesus walking on the water and it had made its point, yes, we worship Jesus too, you might add to it in order to give the story a new spin. You might, as Borncombe, Bart, and Held did in their great classic of redaction, criticism, tradition, and interpretation in Matthew, you might suggest that Matthew added it to make a homiletical point about faith, to make Peter stand for the reader who ought to keep his eyes focused on Jesus, or he will sink into the problems of his life. And surely every time anyone has ever preached on that, that has been the point, and rightly so. Isn't it more likely this more spectacular one is the later, because people tend to blow up and embellish stories, not to knock them down? Or if I have a story in which Jesus appears raised from the dead to a few guys, and then I have one where he appears to over 500 people at the same time, which one is likely to be the subsequent one? Well, the 500. If that had happened, how would you not hear of it in earlier sources? Whereas if it hadn't, and people had kind of gotten used to the idea that he had appeared to only a few people, or since it was behind closed doors, some had begun to say, wait a minute, what evidence is this? It's probably a hoax. Then you might have people say, oh, well, he appeared to over 500 in public at one time. Take that. Or the thing with the guard at Jesus' tomb in Matthew. How is it that three Gospels have nothing to say about Roman guards posted at the tomb to impede the resurrection, but then one suddenly does? Right? Is it really possible that the story originally featured those guards, and Mark, Luke, and John decided, I think I'm going to leave that out. What's the big deal? It's just, I mean, you weren't there. You don't know what happened. But just common sense dictates, no, the stories grow in the telling. They don't shrink in the telling. And, of course, all of these things are that way, right? All the historian can do is deal in probabilities. You're not trying to be the Pope decreeing infallibly what happened in the past. Nobody knows that, right? But all you can do is to approach it with probability, and then you have to deal with criteria like this. Seems to me, you ask, is it even worth the effort to manipulate these criteria? Well, yeah, I think you can. It's a fascinating thing that does bring results, even if the results are purely negative. If the Son of Man shrinks to the vanishing point, at least it's good to know that than to kid yourself. Who was the Steve from Bloomington, Indiana asks, we know the Gospels are anonymous, but who was the first to attribute them to Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John? Was it Irenaeus, which would be about 180 AD? I'm familiar with the traditions of Papias and his references to Mark and Matthew, but I have yet to find any other early 2nd century sources. Can you recommend any books on this topic? Well, one that takes all of this quite seriously is by Martin Hengel, Hengel, a great scholar, though I think credulously conservative on this one. I tend to go with D.F. Strauss, who has an enlightening discussion on this, which is, however, hard to obtain. It's in his Life of Jesus for the People, not his Life of Jesus critically examined, but a second version he did later. In that he shows how not only are there not other early 2nd century or mid-2nd century sources, but, there are a couple like Clement of Alexandria, but who seems to be just adding on to this stuff. There's no independent ones. Strauss points out that not only does Papias know only these two Gospels, it doesn't know anything about Luke or John, implying he's never heard of them. They've not yet been written or not reached him. But that we can't be that sure that he meant our Gospels of Mark and Matthew because of what he says about them. It doesn't sound like he's talking about ours. He says that Matthew is the sayings of the Lord. Matthew compiled the sayings of the Lord in Hebrew. That doesn't seem to be the case. Matthew appears to be based on the Greek Mark. I realize that's opening a can of worms. But he says that Mark is trying to give us the eyewitness reminiscences of Peter. Well, it doesn't sound like that. I mean, if a book that does sound like that in form would be the preaching of John, part of the Acts of John, where they actually have John say, "Brethren, this is what I remember. Jesus used to do this and say that." It's not accurate. It's late Gnostic type stuff. But at least that's what you would expect of a text that was trying to present the table talk of the apostle, his memories of Jesus. As Dennis Nynham points out, that's just not stylistically or formally what you have in Mark. There were other books attributed to Mark and Matthew, other books that did purport to be the preaching of Peter, one of them called the preaching of Peter, the Charagmata Petru. Could he be referring to that? There were other texts that were supposed to be attributed to Matthew. The Gospel according to the Hebrews was supposed to be another version of it. The infancy Gospel of Matthew. The traditions of Matthias. People had trouble keeping Matthew and Matthias straight. The book of Thomas the Contender, written down by Matthias or Matthew. We can't be that sure what Papias is even talking about. Now, when Irenaeus quotes Papias, he is quoting him as if he is talking about our Matthew and Mark. And then he adds that Luke was written down by the companion of Paul to preserve Paul's preaching, but it's obvious he's just copying the pattern of what Papias says about Mark. He's just trying to say the same thing about Luke that Papias, he thought, said about Mark. It's clear, however, Luke has little or nothing to do with whatever Paul would have preached. And so we don't really have any kind of anchor for even these names being attached to the Gospels, much less the identity of the names. Mark was the most common male name in the whole Greco-Roman civilization. Luke was number 2. Could have been anybody. Just like the Gospel according to Bob in our day. When did the traditions of the apostles being martyred first pop up? Well, aside from the two of them mentioned in the mid-2nd century in the book of Acts, with James, son of Zebedee, and though the Gospels imply John, son of Zebedee, might have gotten it at the same time. And the left hanging implication that Paul was martyred, also, though Luke doesn't come out and say so. Our information about this occurs first in 1 Clement, actually an anonymous writing, but attributed to Clement, the Bishop of Rome, around 80 or 90 A.D., I go to the Tübingen school in rejecting that. I think there is no reason to consider this even a unitary writing. It drags on for 60-plus long, boring chapters. It is a digest of boring material, but early on it does talk about jealousy as the motive for those who put Peter and Paul to death when they gave witness, or you could also translate, were martyred in Rome, or in the ultimate West, I think it says. That's kind of cagey, but it's, I think, 2nd century material that sounds to me like it is echoing the apocryphal Acts of Peter and Paul and others, where it is the jealousy of husbands estranged from the female converts of the apostles who arranged their arrest and death. These are grossly legendary traditions, and I think we really have no reliable evidence about the deaths of Paul or anybody else except maybe James, the son of Zebedee. We assume Paul and Peter were put to death at the hand of Nero, but we only have legendary and fragmentary sources, so I think that is one of these places where we just go with what hints, what crumbs we have, and perhaps we shouldn't. We shouldn't convert agnosticism into fideism. If there's only room for uncertainty, then let's leave it at that. We'll have more great questions to address, but plan on doing it next week. Time flies when you're having fun. I'm Robert M. Price at the Bible Geek, and I invite you to look at my website, robertmprice.mindvendor.com. Mindvendor is O-R, not E-R. There you'll find a lot of my writings. You can see some that are listed but not reproduced there, and request that they be put up. We're trying to get them up, but there's so many of them. Might as well do it according to your priorities. And, please do check out my various books. I'd love more questions based on them. An author's always happy to be able to expound at greater length on these things. Soon my books, The Reason-Driven Life and the Pre-Nicene New Testament, will be out, at least in 2 or 3 months, I'd say, and there are more to follow up. If you have an idea for something you'd like me to write, let me know. I'll take it under advisement. And also, let me thank those of you who have sent in PayPal contributions. Being one of these impoverished scholars, that comes in handy. Shall I say, whoever gives a skeptic a cup of cold water will receive a skeptic's reward. Of course, that might mean you will find yourself in a position in which cold water would come in mighty handy, as Dives once did. But at any rate, we'll that is much appreciated. I try to get back to individuals, but sometimes I cannot pick up on their email. First Clement, by the way, someone asked, will not be in the Pre-Nicene New Testament. The book is scheduled for April, but who knows? Gordon asks, where would I prefer to find feedback on a second show? Why don't you write in to my Bible Geek question page on robertmprice.mindvendor.com. Good question. Wildside Press, someone asks, is it now defunct? It is not. It's just that they have so many interesting projects going that it's tough for them to get them all out. I edit Strange Tales fiction magazine for them, and they've got all kinds of things going on. So it's John Betancourt is the struggling publisher, does a great job of it. See you next week.